The morning sun beat down on Riverside Heights, a peaceful suburban neighborhood where nothing much ever happened. At least that's what most folks thought. But on this particular Tuesday, everything was about to change. Nancy Turner was having what she kept calling the absolute worst day of my life to anyone who would listen. Her hairdresser had ruined her expensive highlights. The coffee shop had messed up her complicated order. And now, the boutique on Main Street was refusing to take back the designer purse she'd bought last week. "I don't care what your policy says. I want to speak to the owner right now." Nancy's voice echoed through the small store as other customers lowered their eyes and pretended not to notice. Her perfectly manicured finger jabbed the air inches from the face of the young black woman behind the counter. "Ma'am, as I explained, we can't accept returns on sale items. The owner isn't available today, but I'd be happy to." "You people never want to help," Nancy snapped, her face flushing red. "I spend thousands here. Do you know who I am in this town?" The shop assistant kept her composure even as Nancy continued her tirade. Finally, after threatening to destroy this place on social media, Nancy stormed out, slamming the door so hard the welcome bell nearly broke off its hinge. Back in her shiny white luxury SUV, Nancy was seething. She jammed her key into the ignition and peeled out of the parking space, nearly hitting a mother with a stroller who had to jump back onto the sidewalk. Nancy barely noticed. She was too busy fumbling with her phone, trying to post her outrage online while steering with her knees. The speedometer crept up as she entered the school zone near Riverside Elementary. Officer Thomas was standing in the middle of the crosswalk, his reflective vest bright in the morning sun. He'd been with the police department for 15 years, and school traffic duty was something he took seriously. Just last month, there'd been a close call with a distracted driver, and the chief had assigned extra patrols to the area. He spotted the white SUV right away. It was doing at least 40 in a 15-mile-per-hour zone. Without hesitation, Officer Thomas stepped forward, raising his hand in a clear signal to stop. For a moment, it seemed like Nancy hadn't seen him. Then her eyes flicked up from her phone, and she slammed on her brakes, coming to a screeching halt just feet away from where he stood. Officer Thomas approached the driver's side window, already taking out his notepad. "License and registration, please," he said firmly but politely. Nancy rolled down her window just enough to speak through it. "Do you know who my husband is? He plays golf with your police chief every weekend." "Ma'am, you were going more than double the speed limit in a school zone," Officer Thomas explained, his tone remaining professional. "I need to see your license and registration." Something in Nancy snapped. Maybe it was the culmination of her terrible morning. Maybe it was being told no by someone she considered beneath her. Whatever the reason, what happened next would change multiple lives forever. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, then louder. "I'm not giving you anything. You're just targeting me because of my car." Officer Thomas leaned slightly closer to the window. "Ma'am, this isn't optional. If you don't provide your—" "Get away from my car," Nancy shouted, her voice taking on an ugly tone. Then came the words that several witnesses would later repeat in their statements, vile racial slurs that made nearby parents gasp and cover their children's ears. Officer Thomas's expression remained neutral, though something flickered briefly in his eyes. In 15 years on the force, he'd heard it all before. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he said, his hand moving to the door handle. That's when Nancy made her decision. A decision that would land her face on every news channel in the country by nightfall. She threw her SUV into drive. Officer Thomas had just enough time to realize what was happening. His eyes widened as the vehicle lurched forward, catching him across the legs and hip. The impact sent him sprawling onto the pavement as Nancy accelerated away, weaving through the school traffic. Parents rushed to help the fallen officer, while others frantically called 911. A teacher used her cell phone to snap a photo of the SUV's license plate as it disappeared around the corner. Officer Thomas lay on the asphalt, conscious but in serious pain. Blood seeped through his uniform pants where he'd been struck and then dragged several feet. "She hit him on purpose," one witness kept saying to another as they waited for the ambulance. "She looked right at him and hit the gas." As sirens wailed in the distance, no one knew that this was just the beginning of a story that would grip their community for months to come, a story about privilege, racism, and ultimately, Accountability. The ambulance siren wailed through the normally quiet streets of Riverside Heights as it raced toward County Hospital. Inside, Officer Thomas lay strapped to a gurney, his face tight with pain despite the medication the paramedics had given him. Each bump in the road sent fresh waves of agony through his broken leg. "Hang in there," said the young paramedic, checking his vitals. "We're almost there." Officer Thomas nodded, but his mind wasn't on his injuries. He was thinking about his 2 kids who would be waiting for him to pick them up after school, a promise he now couldn't keep. And he was thinking about the woman who'd done this to him, wondering if she realized how much trouble she was in. Back at the scene, yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze as officers collected evidence and interviewed witnesses. Parents huddled in small groups, still shocked by what they'd seen. Cell phones had captured most of the incident, and these videos were already making their way to the police station and social media. "I got the whole thing," said a dad in a business suit, showing his phone to Detective Rivera. You can clearly hear what she called him before she hit the gas. It was awful. Detective Rivera nodded grimly as she watched the footage. The SUV's license plate was clearly visible, and the driver's face was captured in perfect detail as she shouted those hateful words. It wouldn't take long to find her. At the station, the police chief called an emergency briefing. "Officer Thomas is one of our best," he told the assembled officers, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his anger. 15 years on the force. 2 commendations for bravery. And today he was run down while protecting school children. The room was silent except for the scratching of pens on notepads. "This isn't just a hit and run," the chief continued. "Based on witness statements and video evidence, we're treating this as a hate crime. The suspect, Nancy Turner, is considered dangerous. We've got her address, her workplace, and we're monitoring all routes out of town. Find her. Today." As officers dispersed to begin the search, the chief checked his phone. There was a text from the hospital. Officer Thomas was in surgery. At County Hospital, the waiting room filled quickly. Fellow officers arrived in pairs and groups, some still in uniform, others having rushed over from home. Officer Thomas's wife paced near the surgery doors, stopping only to answer questions from the doctors or to check her phone for updates from the babysitter watching their youngest child. "He's going to be okay," said Officer Rodriguez, a close friend who'd worked with Thomas since they were rookies. "He's the toughest guy I know." Mrs. Thomas tried to smile, but fear kept her face tight. "They said his leg is broken in 2 places, and he hit his head when he fell." News vans had begun to gather outside the hospital. The story was spreading fast. A black police officer deliberately struck by a white woman who'd hurled racial slurs before fleeing the scene. Reporters were already going live from the school zone, interviewing witnesses and showing footage of the bloody pavement where Officer Thomas had fallen. Meanwhile, across town, Nancy Turner was beginning to realize the magnitude of what she'd done. The calm, self-assured woman who demanded special treatment at the boutique was gone. In her place was someone wild-eyed and frantic, throwing clothes into a suitcase while constantly checking her phone. Her social media accounts were exploding with notifications. Friends, family, and strangers were messaging her, some asking if she was the woman from the videos, others already condemning her. Her husband had called 8 times, his messages growing increasingly desperate. "They're saying you ran over a cop. Please tell me that's not true. Call me back." Nancy ignored the calls and kept packing. She'd go to their lake house upstate. Lay low for a while until her lawyer could fix this mess as he'd fixed her speeding tickets and that DUI last year. But even as she made these plans, a more rational part of her brain knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with money or connections. The dashcam footage from Officer Thomas's patrol car had already been reviewed. The officer's body camera had captured her face and her words in high definition. And now, less than 2 hours after the incident, a judge had signed a warrant for her arrest. As evening fell, a GoFundMe page for Officer Thomas's family had raised over $50,000. Messages of support poured in from across the country. Local restaurants sent food to the hospital waiting room, where officers maintained a constant vigil. The mayor visited briefly, promising full support for the Thomas family and vowing that justice would be served. In the surgical recovery room, Officer Thomas finally opened his eyes. His wife was there, holding his hand. "The kids?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "They're fine. My mum picked them up from school, she assured him. Don't worry about anything right now. Officer Thomas squeezed her hand weakly. Did they find her? Before his wife could answer, there was a soft knock at the door. Detective Rivera entered, her face sullen but with a hint of satisfaction. We've got every available officer looking for her, she said, and we just got word. Her credit card was used at a gas station 20 miles north of here. We're closing in. Officer Thomas nodded, letting his eyes close again. The painkillers were pulling him back under, but he felt a small measure of relief. The woman who'd tried to kill him wouldn't get away with it. Not this time, not in his town. And as he drifted off to sleep, he didn't know that dozens of officers had volunteered to work overtime to find Nancy Turner, or that half the state was now looking for her white SUV with its distinctive vanity plate that read BLESSAD. Nancy's hands shook as she steered her SUV along the winding mountain roads. The radio had been talking about her for the past hour. Dangerous fugitive, they called her. Armed and potentially dangerous. She almost laughed at that part. She'd never even held a gun. The gas station attendant had given her a strange look when she paid for her fuel. Had he recognized her? Nancy tugged her baseball cap lower and checked the rearview mirror for the 100th time. No police cars yet, but every set of headlights made her heart race. Her lake house stood dark and quiet at the end of a gravel driveway. Nancy hadn't visited since last summer, and the musty smell hit her as soon as she pushed open the door. Dust covers draped the furniture like ghosts. She didn't bother removing them or turning on many lights, just the small lamp in the kitchen while she tried to think. This is all a misunderstanding, she whispered to herself as she poured a large glass of the wine she brought. That cop stepped right in front of my car. Anyone would have panicked. But even as she said the words, her mind replayed what had really happened. The officer's surprised face as she hit the gas. The thud of his body against her car. How she'd kept driving without looking back. Nancy's phone buzzed again, her husband calling for the 20th time. She finally answered. "Where are you?" he demanded, his voice a mix of anger and fear. "There are police at our house. They're searching everything." "I'm safe," she said. "Don't worry about me. Just tell them you don't know where I am." "Are you crazy? They're saying you ran over a police officer. They showed me the video, Nancy. The video." His voice broke. "How could you say those things? Do something like that?" "He was harassing me," Nancy snapped. "You weren't there. You don't understand what happened." The whole country saw what happened. It's everywhere. The news, social media. Your face is on TV right now. Her husband's voice had risen to a shout. "Our kids are seeing this, Nancy. Their friends are seeing it too." Nancy felt sick. She hadn't thought about her children, hadn't considered how this would affect them. "Look," her husband continued, more quietly now. "The officer survived. He's injured, but he's going to be okay. Turn yourself in. We'll get you the best lawyer. But if you keep running, this only gets worse." The line went silent for a moment. "Nancy, are you still there?" She hung up without answering and turned her phone off completely. Then she threw it across the room. Outside, an owl hooted in the darkness. Nancy startled at the sound, then laughed nervously at herself. She was jumpy, exhausted. She needed to sleep, and things would seem clearer in the morning. She'd call her lawyer then. He'd know what to do. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old lake house made her sit up in alarm. Every distant engine sound had her peering through the curtains, and when she did drift off, her dreams were filled with flashing lights and sirens. Morning came with gray skies and light rain. Nancy made coffee and turned on the small TV in the kitchen, immediately regretting it. There she was, her driver's license photo displayed next to footage from the school zone. The reporter's voice was grim as she described the racially motivated attack on a respected officer. They knew about her lake house. The reporter mentioned it specifically. Police are searching several properties owned by the Turner family, including a vacation home in Pine Lake County. Nancy's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. They were coming. Maybe they were already on their way. She rushed to the window, then to the back door, checking for any sign of police. Nothing yet, but it was only a matter of time. Nancy grabbed her purse and car keys. She had to leave now. But where would she go? Her face was everywhere. Her credit cards were being tracked. Her license plate number was being broadcast on every news channel. She had some cash, about $2,000 she'd grabbed from their home safe, but how long would that last? Maybe she could reach out to her cousin in Canada, or her college roommate who'd moved to Mexico years ago, someone who would hide her until this blew over. "This isn't blowing over," a small voice in her head whispered. "You can't outrun this." Nancy ignored the voice. She couldn't face what was waiting for her if she gave up. Jail, public shame, divorce, losing her children. Running was her only option. She threw her few belongings back into her suitcase and peered out the front window one more time. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the roof. Perfect weather for a getaway, she thought. Low visibility. Fewer people on the roads. Nancy loaded her car and backed down the driveway carefully, avoiding the puddles that might make her tires spin and get her stuck. At the main road, she hesitated. Left would take her deeper into the mountains. Right would lead back toward the interstate. More police on the interstate, probably, but also more places to disappear into. She turned right, keeping her speed exactly at the limit. The wipers swept back and forth, clearing her view for seconds at a time before the rain obscured it again. Nancy felt almost calm now that she was moving. She had money, a full tank of gas, and a head start. She could make it to Ohio by nightfall, maybe even Pennsylvania. 10 miles down the road, Nancy spotted a small country store and pulled in. She needed supplies, food, water, maybe a different hat or sunglasses to change her appearance. The parking lot was empty except for an old pickup truck. Good, fewer people to recognize her. The bell over the door jingled as she entered. The man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper and nodded a greeting. Nancy kept her head down, grabbing a basket and moving quickly through the aisles. Bottled water, protein bars, a baseball cap with a local team's logo. She added sunglasses, hair dye, and some basic makeup. At the counter, she avoided eye contact, keeping her face angled away from the security camera in the corner. "Nasty weather we're having," the clerk commented as he rang up her items. "Yeah," Nancy mumbled. "Real bad." "You passing through or staying at one of the lake houses?" he asked, making conversation as he bagged her purchases. Nancy's pulse quickened, "Just passing through." The clerk nodded, then glanced at the TV mounted on the wall behind him. The sound was off, but Nancy could see the news was still running the story about her. Her photo filled the screen. The clerk looked back at Nancy, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That'll be $42.67, he said, his voice different now. Cautious. Nancy handed him 3 $20 bills. "Keep the change," she said, grabbing her bags and heading for the door. Behind her, she heard the soft murmur of the clerk speaking into a phone. Detective Rivera rubbed her tired eyes as she studied the map spread across the conference table. Red pins marked confirmed sightings of Nancy Turner, blue pins showed possible sightings, and yellow highlighted the properties owned by the Turner family. The investigation room hummed with activity as officers fielded calls from the public and coordinated with state police. "We've got something," called Officer Wilson, covering the mouthpiece of his phone. "Store owner in Pine Creek, about 12 miles from the lake house. Says a woman matching Turner's description just bought supplies. Seemed nervous, paid cash, left in a hurry." Detective Rivera straightened up instantly. "Is he certain?" "Says he's 90% sure. She was wearing a cap, but when he saw her picture on the news, he recognized her. She bought hair dye, by the way." "Tell him not to approach her if she comes back," Rivera instructed, already grabbing her jacket. "We're on our way. And get roadblocks set up on all routes leading away from Pine Creek." As Rivera and her team headed out, she stopped briefly at Officer Thomas's desk. His nameplate sat there, a small photo of his kids tucked into the corner of his computer monitor. The thought of him lying in a hospital bed while this woman tried to escape justice made Rivera's jaw clench. The hospital room was quieter now. Most of the officers had returned to duty, but one always remained posted outside the door. Officer Thomas sat propped up in bed, his broken leg elevated and heavily bandaged. The pain medication made his thoughts fuzzy, but he was alert enough to watch the news on the small TV mounted to the wall. "You don't need to see this," his wife said, reaching for the remote. The news was showing footage from the school zone again. "I do," he insisted gently. "I need to know what's happening." The reporter on screen stood in front of the country store in Pine Creek. Sources tell us Turner purchased supplies here approximately 3 hours ago. Police have established checkpoints throughout the area but have not yet located the suspect or her vehicle. Officer Thomas shifted in bed, wincing as pain shot through his leg despite the medication. She's desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. His wife took his hand. The whole country is looking for her. They'll find her. Meanwhile, miles away, Nancy had abandoned her conspicuous white SUV. After leaving the store, she'd driven deep into the woods on a logging road, covering the vehicle with branches and leaves. Now she trudged along a hiking trail, carrying only what she could fit in a backpack. The hair dye would have to wait. Rain dripped from the trees overhead, soaking through her expensive jacket. Her designer shoes, meant for office carpets and restaurant floors, were already muddy and worn. Nancy had never been much of an outdoors woman, despite owning a lake house. The woods felt alien and threatening. Every distant sound, a branch snapping, birds taking flight, made her freeze in panic. Were those voices she heard police dogs, or just her imagination? Nancy's plan, hastily formed after fleeing the store, was to hike to the next town over. There she would find a bus station or perhaps steal a car. She knew how to hotwire one. An ex-boyfriend had shown her in college. She'd never thought she'd use that knowledge. The hiking trail forked, and Nancy hesitated. The path to the left seemed more traveled, likely leading to a main road. The right fork disappeared into thicker woods. After a moment's consideration, she went left. She couldn't handle getting lost on top of everything else. An hour later, exhausted and hungry, Nancy spotted a highway through the trees. She crouched behind a fallen log, watching for police cars. A few vehicles passed, but none were law enforcement. Taking a deep breath, she emerged from the woods and began walking along the shoulder, thumb out whenever a civilian car approached. Back at the investigation room, Detective Rivera returned from Pine Creek frustrated but not discouraged. "She's on foot," she announced to the team. Her SUV was found hidden off a logging road. Canine units are tracking her scent from there. "We've got calls from 3 drivers reporting a woman hitchhiking on Highway 16, another officer reported. Description matches. Looks like she's heading east. Rivera nodded. That makes sense. East takes her toward the state line. Alert all units and get me a helicopter if one's available. I want eyes in the sky. The next call came just 20 minutes later. A trucker had picked up a hitchhiker matching Nancy's description and become suspicious when she offered him $500 to drive her to the next state without stopping. He pretended to agree, then called 911 at the first opportunity. "He's keeping her talking," said Officer Wilson, excitement in his voice. "Says he told her his CB radio was broken so she wouldn't hear any chatter about roadblocks ahead. They're 10 miles from the checkpoint at the county line." The room erupted in activity. This was it, their chance to end this chase before anyone else got hurt. At the county line checkpoint, state troopers and local police positioned their vehicles across the highway. Officers with rifles took positions behind their cars, though everyone hoped weapons wouldn't be necessary. An ambulance waited nearby, standard procedure for high-risk arrests. "Remember, approach with extreme caution," the state police captain reminded his officers. "We have no confirmation that she's unarmed." The minutes ticked by slowly. Then headlights appeared in the distance. A semi-truck approached, moving at exactly the speed limit. As it neared the roadblock, its brake lights flashed on, and the massive vehicle slowed to a stop 50 yards away. "Driver reports the suspect is in the passenger seat," came the update over the radio. "She's agitated but doesn't appear to be armed." Officers moved forward, using the truck's cab as cover. The driver's door opened slowly, and the trucker emerged with his hands raised. "She's still inside," he called, pretty freaked out. Detective Rivera approached the passenger side, weapon drawn but pointed downward. Through the window, she could see Nancy Turner, hair disheveled, mascara streaked down her face, looking nothing like the polished, arrogant woman from the boutique security footage. "Nancy Turner," Rivera called firmly. "This is Detective Rivera with the county police. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the passenger door swung open. Nancy stepped down from the cab, her hands trembling but raised above her head. Her eyes darted around wildly, taking in the wall of officers and vehicles blocking her escape. "I want my lawyer," she said, her voice barely audible over the idling truck engine. "This is all a misunderstanding." Detective Rivera holstered her weapon and approached with handcuffs. "Nancy Turner, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of a police officer, hate crime, fleeing the scene of an accident, and evading arrest." As the cuffs clicked around her wrists, Nancy seemed to deflate completely. The reality of her situation finally hit her. There would be no escape, no fixing this, no going back to her comfortable life. At the hospital, Officer Thomas watched the live coverage of the arrest on TV. His wife squeezed his hand as they showed Nancy being placed in the back of a police car, head bowed. "It's over," she whispered. But Officer Thomas shook his head slightly. "The investigation is over," he corrected quietly. "The rest is just beginning." The county courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the clear blue sky. Everyone wanted a glimpse of the woman they'd been hearing about for days. The police cruiser pulled up to the side entrance, away from the main crowd. Officers flanked the vehicle as the back door opened. Nancy stepped out, blinking in the bright sunlight. She looked nothing like the polished real estate agent from her company headshot. Her designer clothes had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit. Her carefully highlighted hair hung limp around her face. Without makeup, she looked older, smaller somehow. Inside the courthouse, Nancy's lawyer waited. He was an older man with silver hair and an expensive suit, the best attorney her husband's money could hire. When Nancy was led into the small conference room, he stood and offered a tight smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Turner," he said formally. No warmth, no reassurance. Nancy knew that look. She'd seen it on the faces of colleagues when someone made a career-ending mistake. The look that said, "I'll do my job, but I don't like you." "Are you going to get me out of here?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "My husband said he'd pay whatever bail they set." The lawyer cleared his throat. "That's what we need to discuss. The charges against you are extremely serious. Attempted murder of a police officer, hate crime enhancements, fleeing the scene, evading arrest." He ticked them off on his fingers. "The prosecutor is pushing for no bail." "No bail?" Nancy's voice rose. "That's ridiculous. I'm not some criminal." The lawyer's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Turner, I've reviewed the evidence. The dash cam footage, the body cam video, the witness statements, the social media posts that have surfaced from your accounts going back several years." He paused. "I need to be honest with you. This is not a case we're likely to win at trial." Nancy stared at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying our best strategy is to negotiate a plea deal. Your husband has authorized me to begin those discussions." Before Nancy could respond, the door opened. A court officer stood there. "They're ready for the arraignment." The courtroom fell silent as Nancy entered. She kept her eyes down, not wanting to see the faces of the spectators. But she felt them watching her, judging her. As she took her place beside her lawyer, she finally looked up and locked eyes with Officer Thomas's wife, sitting in the front row. The woman's gaze was steady, unflinching. Not angry, exactly, but something deeper. Something that made Nancy look away first. The judge entered, and everyone rose. As the charges were read aloud, Nancy felt each word like a physical blow. The legal terms, malice aforethought, aggravated assault, racial animus, transformed her actions from a moment of rage into something calculated and evil. When asked how she pled, Nancy's voice was barely audible. Not guilty. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Her lawyer had advised this plea for now, though he'd made it clear they would likely change it later as part of a deal. The prosecutor stood, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Your Honor, the state requests that the defendant be held without bail. She has already demonstrated her willingness to flee, and the evidence against her is overwhelming. Additionally, the defendant has significant financial resources that would make her a flight risk." Nancy's lawyer made his counterarguments, her ties to the community, her children, her lack of prior criminal record. But she could tell from the judge's expression that it was futile. "Bail is denied," the judge announced. "The defendant will remain in custody until trial." And just like that, Nancy's world shrank to the size of a cell. As the court officers led her away, she caught a glimpse of her husband in the gallery. He didn't wave or nod. His face was a mask of shame and anger. Back at the county jail, Nancy was processed again. Fingerprints, photographs, more orange clothing. The other inmates whispered as she passed. They knew who she was. Everyone did. Her cell was small and bare, a metal bunk with a thin mattress, a stainless steel toilet, a small sink. The door clanged shut behind her with a finality that made her flinch. That night, Nancy lay awake listening to the strange sounds of the jail, women crying, guards' shoes on concrete. Somewhere, a radio played softly. She thought about her children. What were they being told? What would they think of her now? Days bled together. Nancy's lawyer visited with updates on the case, none of them good. More evidence had surfaced, text messages she'd sent complaining about those people moving into her neighborhood. Social media comments that revealed a pattern of prejudice she'd never acknowledged, even to herself. The media coverage continued, though with a slightly different turn now. Reporters had dug into her past, interviewing former colleagues and employees. A house cleaner described being accused of stealing when she'd moved a piece of jewelry while dusting. A landscaper recalled being followed around the yard by Nancy as if she expected him to steal the gardening tools. Each story painted a picture of a woman who'd spent years looking down on others, making assumptions based on race, using her privilege as a weapon. Nancy wanted to scream that they were lying, that she wasn't that person. But deep down, she recognized herself in their stories. On the 7th day of her incarceration, her husband finally visited. He sat across from her at the visitation table, a glass barrier between them. "Where are the kids?" Nancy asked immediately. "At my mother's," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "I thought it was best, with all the reporters camped outside the house." Nancy nodded. "Are they okay?" "No, Nancy, they're not okay. Their friends have stopped calling. Their teachers called me in for a meeting about supporting them through this difficult time." Our daughter cried herself to sleep every night for a week. Tears filled Nancy's eyes. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Her husband finally looked directly at her. "That's the problem, isn't it? You never meant it, but you still did it. And not just the incident with the officer. All of it, the way you've talked about people, treated people." He sighed heavily. "I'd filed for divorce. My lawyer will contact yours with the details." Nancy felt like she'd been slapped. "You're leaving me? Now? When I need you most?" "I left the moment you decided to run that man down," he said quietly. "I just didn't know it until I saw the video." He stood up. "I'll make sure the kids write to you. It's the right thing for them to know their mother, despite everything." As he turned to leave, Nancy pressed her hand against the glass. "Wait, please." But he kept walking, and the door closed behind him with the same finality as her cell door. That night, alone in her cell, Nancy cried until she had no tears left. Everything was gone, her freedom, her family, her future. All because of one moment of rage, one terrible decision. But as the hours passed, something shifted inside her. For the first time, she began to think about Officer Thomas, not as the man who'd ruined her life by trying to give her a ticket, but as a person she'd hurt terribly for no reason at all. Officer Thomas adjusted his tie in the courthouse bathroom mirror. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of standing for too long. His leg was healing, but slowly. The doctors said he might always walk with a slight limp. "You ready?" Detective Rivera asked, waiting by the door. Officer Thomas nodded. Today was the day, Nancy Turner's plea hearing. After weeks of negotiations between her lawyer and the prosecutor, they'd reached a deal. The details weren't public yet, but rumors had spread through the department. The courtroom was packed even tighter than before. News of the plea deal had drawn national media. Officer Thomas took his seat in the front row, his wife beside him holding his hand. Several rows back, Nancy's husband sat alone. Their children weren't present, a small mercy in this whole ugly situation. When Nancy entered, Officer Thomas felt his wife's grip tighten. This was the first time he'd seen Nancy in person since the incident. She looked smaller than he remembered, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. The orange jumpsuit had been replaced by a plain navy blue dress, modest, unassuming, nothing like the designer clothes she'd worn the day she'd run him down. The judge entered and court was called to session, The prosecutor stood first. Your Honor, the state and the defense have reached an agreement. The defendant has agreed to plead guilty to aggravated assault on a peace officer, leaving the scene of an accident with injuries, and the hate crime enhancement. She paused. In exchange, we are withdrawing the attempted murder charge. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge silenced it with a look, then turned to Nancy. Mrs. Turner, do you understand the charges to which you are pleading guilty? Nancy's voice was steady but quiet. Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand that by pleading guilty, you waive your right to a trial by jury? Yes, Your Honor. Before I accept your plea, I need to hear, in your own words, what happened on the day in question. Nancy glanced at her lawyer, who nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath. I was having a bad day, she began, then stopped. No, that's not right. That sounds like an excuse, and there is no excuse for what I did. She started again. I was pulled over for speeding in a school zone. Officer Thomas approached my vehicle and asked for my license and registration. I was angry about being stopped, and I said terrible things to him. Racist things. Her voice cracked slightly. When he told me to step out of the vehicle, I put the car in drive and deliberately hit him. Then I drove away, knowing he was injured. The judge's expression remained neutral. And do you now recognize that your actions were wrong? Nancy looked up, and for the first time, her eyes met Officer Thomas's. Yes, Your Honor. What I did was inexcusable. I hurt someone who was just doing his job, and I did it because of the color of his skin. Tears welled in her eyes. I can never take that back, but I am truly sorry. The judge nodded. I accept your guilty plea. We will proceed to sentencing. What followed was a series of statements. The prosecutor outlined the severity of the crime, the premeditated nature of the assault, the defendant's flight from justice. She requested the maximum sentence permitted under the plea agreement, 12 years. Nancy's lawyer spoke of his client's lack of prior criminal history, her community involvement, her role as a mother. He asked for leniency, the minimum sentence of 5 years. Then it was time for victim impact statements. Officer Thomas rose slowly, leaning on his cane. He moved to the podium at the front of the courtroom. The silence was absolute as he adjusted the microphone. Your Honor, he began, his deep voice filling the room. I've been a police officer for 15 years. I've been shot at, punched, and threatened, but nothing prepared me for what happened that day. He described his physical injuries, the broken leg, the concussion, the cuts and bruises. Then he spoke about the other wounds. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without seeing headlights coming at me. My children were afraid to let me go to work. My wife jumped every time a car drove past our house. He paused. But the hardest part wasn't the physical pain or even the fear. It was explaining to my kids why someone would hurt me because of my skin color. Nancy stared at the table in front of her, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what's in Mrs. Turner's heart, Officer Thomas continued. I don't know if she truly understands the damage she caused, not just to me, but to my family, to her own family, and to our community. What I do know is that hate like that doesn't appear from nowhere. It grows over time, fed by small prejudices that go unchallenged. He looked directly at Nancy. I hope that whatever sentence you receive, you use that time to think about how you got here. And I hope when you get out, you work to make sure no one else follows your path. Officer Thomas returned to his seat, and his wife put her arm around his shoulders. Next, it was Nancy's husband who approached the podium. I'm here today not as Mrs. Turner's husband. Our divorce will be finalized next month, but as the father of her children. His voice was strained. Your Honor, our kids ask about their mother every day. They don't understand why she did what she did. Honestly, neither do I. He ran a hand through his hair. But they love her and they need her. I'm asking the court to consider that 2 more lives will be deeply affected by whatever sentence is imposed today. Finally, it was Nancy's turn. She stood unsteadily. I have no right to ask for forgiveness, she said. What I did was monstrous. There's no other word for it. She turned slightly to face Officer Thomas. I've had a lot of time to think in jail. About who I am. About how I became someone who could do such a terrible thing. Her voice shook. I'd always thought of myself as a good person, but good people don't do what I did. Good people don't think the way I thought. She wiped tears from her face. I can't change what happened. I can't undo the harm I caused. All I can do is promise that I'm trying to change, not to get a lighter sentence, but because I never want to be that person again." When she finished, the judge took a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Turner, you committed a serious crime motivated by racial hatred. You deliberately struck a police officer with your vehicle, fled the scene, and evaded arrest. These actions reflect a profound disregard for human life and the law." The judge's gaze was steady. "However, I also recognize your acceptance of responsibility and your expression of remorse." The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for the sentence. "I hereby sentence you to 8 years in state prison. You will be eligible for parole after serving 5 years, contingent upon completion of anger management and racial sensitivity training." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. It was done. As the court officers moved to lead Nancy away, she turned toward Officer Thomas one last time. She didn't speak. What could she possibly say? But in her eyes was something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Outside the courthouse, reporters thrust microphones at Officer Thomas. "Are you satisfied with the sentence? Do you forgive Nancy Turner? Will you return to duty?" Officer Thomas raised a hand for quiet. "Justice was served today," he said simply. "Now the healing can begin for everyone involved." As he walked away, leaning on his cane, cameras flashed behind him. But he was looking forward, toward his wife waiting by their car, toward home, toward a future that would be different from what he'd planned but still held hope. And in a prison transport van, Nancy Turner began the first day of her 8-year sentence, carrying with her the weight of what she'd done and the first small spark of a desire to become someone different. 3 years later, Officer Thomas stood at the back of a crowded high school auditorium. He was in uniform again, though he now worked a desk job most days. His leg had healed as well as it could, but running after suspects was a thing of the past. Tonight, he wasn't here on police business. He was here as a father, watching his daughter receive an award for her essay on overcoming adversity. As she approached the podium, he felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. After the incident, his daughter had struggled with anxiety and fear. She'd worried every time he left for work. But gradually, with help from counselors and the unwavering support of their community, she had transformed that fear into purpose. Her essay described how her father's experience had inspired her to start a student group focused on combating prejudice and promoting understanding. When she finished her speech, the applause was thunderous. Officer Thomas wiped tears from his eyes as his wife squeezed his hand. They had come so far from those dark days in the hospital. Their family had been tested, but they had emerged stronger. Later that night, after the celebration dinner and the proud phone calls to grandparents, Officer Thomas sat alone on their back porch. Tomorrow, he would do something he'd been preparing for over a year. Tomorrow, he would visit the state women's prison and sit across from Nancy Turner. The prison visiting room was bright and institutional. Officer Thomas arrived early, going through security with the patience of someone who understood the process from both sides. He chose a table in the corner and waited, his cane propped against his chair. When Nancy entered, he almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the polished real estate agent with the perfect hair and designer clothes. Gone, too, was the broken woman from the courtroom. This Nancy Turner moved with a quiet composure. Her prison-issued clothes were neat, her hair pulled back simply. 3 years had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. She hesitated when she saw him, surprise evident on her face. Their meeting had been arranged through a restorative justice program, but participants weren't told who they would be meeting until they arrived. "Officer Thomas," she said softly as she approached the table. "Mr. Thomas is fine," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I'm not here as a police officer today." Nancy sat down carefully, her hands folded in front of her. "I didn't expect. When they said someone from my case wanted to meet, I thought maybe it was my ex-husband." "He's not part of the program," Officer Thomas said. "But I've been working with them for about a year now. Talking to schools, community groups, sharing my story." Nancy nodded. "They've mentioned you. Your work has inspired a lot of the discussions we have in our group sessions." She paused, a question in her eyes. "Why did you want to see me?" Officer Thomas took his time answering. "For a long time I didn't. I was angry. Not just about my injuries, but about what you took from me. My sense of safety, my trust in people. He touched his leg unconsciously. But holding on to that anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you. Nancy looked down at her hands. I think about what I did every day, about who I was then and how I could have been so blind to my own hatred. Tell me about that, Officer Thomas said, about what you've learned. For the next hour they talked. Nancy told him about the racial sensitivity courses she'd taken in prison, how at first she'd attended just to improve her chances of parole. But somewhere along the way, the lessons had started to sink in. She'd begun to recognize patterns in her thinking, prejudices so deeply ingrained she'd never questioned them. I grew up in a bubble, she explained. Everyone looked like me, thought like me. Different meant dangerous. When I finally met people who didn't fit that mold, I wasn't equipped to see them as fully human. She told him about the prison literacy program she now helped run, working with women who had never been given the opportunities she had taken for granted. How teaching had opened her eyes to struggles she'd never imagined. Officer Thomas listened, really listened. When she finished, he shared his own journey, the physical therapy, the nightmares, the way his children now worried when he left for work. But he also told her about the positive changes, how his daughter had found her voice as an advocate, how his son wanted to become a lawyer to fight for civil rights. Something good came from something terrible, he said. Not because of what you did, but because of how we chose to respond to it. Nancy wiped tears from her eyes. I have no right to ask this, but do you think you could ever forgive me? Officer Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Forgiveness isn't a moment, it's a process. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it. He leaned forward slightly. What about you? Have you forgiven yourself? Nancy shook her head. No, I don't think I should. That's where you're wrong, Officer Thomas said gently. Not forgiving yourself means you're still centered in your own guilt, your own pain. True remorse means using what you've learned to help others. As their time drew to a close, Officer Thomas took a small envelope from his pocket and slid it across the table. My daughter asked me to give you this. Nancy took it with trembling hands. Inside was a carefully folded page from a school notebook. She opened it to find a child's drawing, simple figures holding hands in a circle. At the bottom was written, "People can change. I hope you do." She drew this right after the trial, Officer Thomas explained. She wanted you to have it then, but I wasn't ready. Now I think maybe we both are. When the guard announced that visiting hours were ending, they stood to say goodbye. There was an awkward moment. What was the proper way to end such a meeting? Then Officer Thomas extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Nancy took it. Thank you for coming, she said, not just for me, but for everyone who will hear this story. That's why I'm here, he replied. Stories can change people. Sometimes they can even change the world. 6 months later, Nancy Turner sat before the parole board. She had served just over 3.5 years of her 8-year sentence. The board members reviewed her file, her perfect disciplinary record, her completion of all required programs, her work in the prison literacy project. We have a letter here from Officer Thomas, one board member said. He supports your application for early release. Nancy's eyes widened in surprise. He does. He says you've shown genuine remorse and growth. He believes you'll use your freedom to make amends in meaningful ways. 2 weeks later, Nancy walked out of prison. There were no cameras, no reporters. Her story had faded from the headlines years ago. Her ex-husband waited in the parking lot with their children, now teenagers. The reunion was awkward but hopeful. They would never be a family again, but they were finding a new way to be connected. Nancy had no illusions about what awaited her. Her real estate license was gone. Her former social circle had abandoned her. Finding employment with a felony conviction would be challenging. But she had made plans during those years behind bars to work with anti-racism organizations, to share her story as a cautionary tale, to use her experience to help others recognize and challenge their own prejudices. On a warm spring day a year after her release, Nancy stood nervously at the podium in a community center meeting room. The audience was small but attentive, participants in a workshop about confronting unconscious bias. At a table near the back sat Officer Thomas and his family. My name is Nancy, she began, and my story begins with the worst decision I ever made. As she spoke, she saw heads nodding in recognition. Not because they had done what she had done, but because they recognized the smaller moments of prejudice in their own lives, the assumptions, the fear of others, the unwillingness to examine their own thinking. When the session ended, people lingered to ask questions, to share their own experiences. Officer Thomas approached with his daughter, now a poised young woman preparing for college. "That was powerful," he said. "You reached them." Nancy smiled tentatively. "One small group at a time. It's not enough, but it's a start." "Sometimes that's all we get," Officer Thomas replied. "A start. The rest is up to those who hear our story." As they walked together toward the exit, a reporter who had been sitting quietly in the back approached them. "Excuse me," she said. "I'd like to write about your work together. Would you be willing to share your story with a wider audience?" Officer Thomas and Nancy exchanged a look, not quite friendship, but something like mutual respect. "Yes," they said, almost in unison, "we would."